Hello and welcome to Global Business, CCTV's new program with insights into Africa's ever-changing business landscape. From Nairobi to Johannesburg, from Lagos to Cairo, from small entrepreneurs to large-scale enterprises, we take you directly to entrepreneurs making the headlines. I'm G2 Abraham here in the Kenyan capital of Nairobi, where it's 9 p.m. It's 2 p.m. in Washington, D.C. and 2 a.m. in Beijing. Wherever you're joining us from, welcome. South Africa's Harmony Gold is writing down $130.5 million to boost exploration efforts. And Egypt's government plans to move its administrative offices east of Cairo. And finally, we focus on a medical practice that's putting a smile on the faces of childless families in South Africa. South Africa's Harmony Gold is writing down $130.5 million on part of an expansion project into previously unmined areas. Now, this is according to the company. An updated feasibility study on the Fakasi project shows that a large amount of capital is required for this exploration. Harmony says the write-down will reduce the net profit of the company. However, this will not have an impact on reported cash balances and cash flow. Harmony has been scaling back capital expenditures in line with industry trends. It plans significantly lower investment in the Papua New Guinea Wi-Fi gold pool mine, which has become its flagship project. Harmony is expected to update investors this month about its current expenditure plans for the project. Now, the Egyptian government has announced an ambitious project to move its capital to a new location. The new capital is planned about 90 kilometers northeast of Cairo. The decision to shift its government's attempt to alleviate congestion in the current capital. Now, Yasser Hakim takes a closer look at how Egyptians view this project.
Constant traffic jams, dangerously high population, bureaucracy and deep centralization. Just a few of the problems of this overpopulated city of 20 million people. Plans are underway to move the capital east.
It will be an administrative capital. Government ministries and offices, presidential headquarters, embassies, banks and stock exchange will move over. The current Cairo will remain a cultural and artistic capital.
The aim is to relieve the burden of Cairo and push the population to new cities. This is the site where the new capital will be located, 90 kilometers northeast of Cairo. It's a little bit deserted right now, but the government says it will be fully operational in about 5 years. Most experts see this move as essential, but some say the timing is wrong.
The government says it will cost £50 billion. I believe it will cost at least triple that amount. The country is fighting bankruptcy, so there's no point in throwing money away in such projects when we need it for more essential needs.
The government says the private sector money will fund this project. It will establish new businesses, attract FDIs, create thousands of jobs and stimulate the economy. Egyptians have a mixed feeling about it.
It could be a good thing. New houses and jobs for the people and clean Cairo from this chaos.
Billions will be spent on long-term projects for our grandchildren. We want solutions to our problems now.
It's been done before in countries like Brazil at high costs. The Egyptian president insists it will be a success story here. Yasser Hakim, CCTV, Cairo.
All right, Yasser Hakim now joins us live for more insights onto this decision. Prime Minister Ibrahim Malib's cabinet is reviewing a proposal that would create a new capital for Egypt. What factors is the government looking at that could entice them to accept this bid?
Well, first of all, they're looking at what's happening in Cairo. It's becoming a high polluted area with a lot of traffic jams, a lot of shanty towns because of the influx of Egyptians from all cities to work in Cairo because this is the main hub for business, for government buildings and so forth. So we get millions coming into Cairo every day from other cities to finalize their paperwork. There's a lot of centralization there. So what they're hoping is that moving out would keep Cairo a bit emptier, a bit easier to control, and also to open up new areas with new housing to move out Egyptians into a new city, to open new businesses and new companies, new construction, and this will stimulate the economy. This will bring more jobs to the people, and maybe at the same time cause some kind of influx of money from foreign businesses that will try to invest in this new city.
How much will this cost, and can the government afford it? Also, how long would it be before this new city is up and running?
Well, the timing, it was supposed to be 10 years, but in his latest speech, the Egyptian president said 10 years is too long. He wants it to be to start by 3 years, to start work, and to be fully operational by 5 years. That's very optimistic, but he says he is targeting only 3 to 5 years. Now, how much it will cost, according to the government statistics, around $50 billion, but the government says the exact amount will be announced maybe in a month when the full studies and feasibility studies would be complete. But right now it says $50 billion. How will it be funded? This is the problem. The experts are saying this is too much money for a government that is facing a high budget deficit and low revenues, and it's just a burden that it's not time for it now. What the government is saying is that it will integrate the private sector into the funding and try to give the private sector more say into how this money will be spent, because the private sector will be the one that's undergoing the construction of the new city.
Now, what would this new move entail as far as government buildings and the access that citizens would have to them?
This is another problem. What experts are saying is that this happened before. This whole plan was in the 1970s by late President Anwar Sadat, and he wanted to move into a new city, and he called it Sadat City, and it failed miserably because simply no one wanted to go there. Even the government employees, when he built the new houses there, they refused to go, simply because there was no infrastructure, there was no transportation. And what they are saying now is that you have to have the proper transportation, which is not there right now. You have to have the proper transportation first for the people to move. You have to have the proper infrastructure like schools, universities, houses, hospitals first, and then you move the buildings, the government buildings, not the other way around. This is number one. Number two, the experts are saying, well, the problem is centralization. It's easier to decentralize. And in every government in every governorate, you have different government buildings. Instead of moving into a new capital and moving the same problems into the new capital as well, as long as Egypt is centralized, then what you're doing is just moving the same problems from Cairo to another city. What you need is decentralization to other cities, to the 24 governorates of Egypt, rather than move all the problems into another city and another capital.
All right, Yasser, we'll be waiting to see what happens with that. Yasser Hakim joining us live from Cairo. Now moving to Nigeria, where the country's power minister says that even if the country produced another 20,000 megawatts, it would still not be enough to meet the power needs. Chinedu Nebu was speaking at the ceremony in Abuja, where the petroleum minister unveiled plans to scale up the generating capacity of Nigeria's gas plants. Now, this is in order to generate 5,000 megawatts of electricity. Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer, but infrastructure vandalism is causing power outages that are costly for the government to be able to repair.
Now, these projects in totality should unlock an additional 370 million scf. That is the projects that we expect to unlock by the end of this year, assuring us of a total of 5,000 megawatts, inclusive of hydro, within the next 4 to 5 months, taking us to the end of 2014. In order to minimize disruptions to supply, NNPC has also concluded a harmonization plan of the maintenance schedule of all gas plants from various suppliers. Therefore, between August and September, all planned maintenance activities will be carried out. Whilst this will create a temporary disruption in our supply to power, It will ensure that from October this year, disruptions due to planned maintenance activities will be extremely minimal.
How do we generate enough power in Nigeria for our people? Currently, it is estimated that the suppressed demand for electricity in Nigeria quadruples the amount of energy produced today. In other words, were we to quadruple the amount of electricity we generate and distribute in Nigeria, we will not have enough power for all Nigerians.
I felt that power is very essential to unlock the potentials of the Nigerian economy. And to do so, we felt that it is important for us to begin to look at what are the issues that are militating against the power, the production of power in the country.
Looking now at how the African markets that we track here closed the week. Now let's look specifically at South Africa. The country's stocks fell for a second straight session as the price of the African bank investments plunged even further on fears the lender may be unable to plug the huge deficit in its finance. And still ahead this week, the U.S. administration and the European Union pledged billions of dollars for investment and development in Africa. We bring you an in-depth analysis of what this means to Africa and your reactions to this major announcement.
Africa is on the move. It's home to 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies.
From small businesses to large-scale enterprises, hear directly from entrepreneurs behind the story. It's about putting you in the picture so you know where Africa fits in the global context.
Global Business, weekdays at this time on CCTV Africa.
We do know that the strike isn't anywhere near close to coming to an end either. That means that those workers are going to sink even further into poverty.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Business. Now, the U.S. administration on Tuesday announced $17 billion in commitments from U.S. businesses to invest in Africa. President Obama unveiled the plans as representatives from nearly 100 American and African companies gathered in Washington to discuss ways to boost economic partnership as Africa's economy enjoys rapid advancement. Now, a decade of solid growth has created a middle class with increased spending power. Statistics by the African Development Bank show this cluster stands at $350 million, making it an ideal trading partner. Even as the U.S. made the pledge this week, other nations, most notably China, have been moving aggressively to tap into the growing African markets. China surpassed the U.S. as Africa's largest trading partner in 2009, and according to the Brookings Institution Africa Growth Initiative, says that China, the EU, Japan, and the U.S. have been the major source of foreign direct investments in sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2000, global FDI stocks in sub-Saharan Africa has increased dramatically from over $33.5 billion to $246.4 billion in 2012. This growth was primarily driven by China, whose FDI grew at an annual rate of 53%, compared with 29% for Japan, 16% for the EU, and 14% for the U.S. Although America is one of the top contributors of the FDI stock to sub-Saharan Africa, less than 1% of the country's global FDI stock abroad is destined for the region. Now, this is set to increase after this week's summit. For more analysis on the Africa's partnership programs, I'm joined now by Sandra Gathman, live in Brussels, and Patrick Obeth, the director at Kenya Private Sector Alliance, the voice for the private sector here in Kenya. He's joining us in studio. Thank you for joining us today. Patrick, the Kenya Private Alliance sector was well represented this week at the U.S.-Africa Summit. What was the takeaway for them?
The main objective of the private sector being present in the U.S. was primarily to forge alliances. We have a lot of American companies that are setting up in Nairobi as a hub for Africa, and this was primarily to welcome them into Kenya and also partner with some of them to be able to anchor them into investing in Africa. Okay. And that was the primary objective of KEPSA going to the U.S.
Okay. The U.S. President Barack Obama has called this summit an extraordinary event, having secured some $37 billion in investments for Africa. Is this same sentiment shared by Africa? If so, why?
It is. If you look at the key investments that are required in Africa, most of them are infrastructure projects. And if you look at the capital base in Africa, we do not have sufficient capital to do the major infrastructure projects require. So the pledge of that amount of money, we see that primarily getting into areas like energy, roads, and railways, which is what Africa needs currently in order to unlock the potential that we have in our resources.
Okay, Sandra, if we can cross over to you. Generally, what has been the response from the EU in regards to these announcements by the U.S.?
Well, from speaking to people here in Brussels, of course, the EU welcomes any initiatives that go toward boosting sustainable growth in Africa. So, of course, businesses being a major driver of that growth, it's important to foster those. And as our guest said, the potential, the economic potential that these kinds of partnerships unlock. Of course, the EU will remain Africa's biggest donor for the time being, but it is in the EU's interest and, of course, Africa's interest to see more private investment in Africa and those kinds of partnerships, those mutual benefits that will see Africa benefit more long-term from this kind of external funding as well, moving away from that donor-dependent relationship Europe has fostered with Africa historically. It's a different picture now, though, in Africa, economically speaking.
Patrick, if we can come back to you. Some have questioned the merit of the summit, saying that if it was indeed about economic matters, why didn't it include American business people and ministers of trade and economic affairs? Has this decision to include heads of state, many of whom don't have an economic background, has this really given Africa the most bang for their buck here? I
think it has, because if you look at the last 4 to 5 years, the private sector in the United States has been reaching to the private sector in Africa. For example, with KEPSA, we have signed a memorandum of agreement with the Corporate Council for Africa in the US, which links the top 100 businesses in the US with Africa. Okay. And we've actually had summits with them outside of this one. What has been lacking has been the engagement at the policy level. And that's really the value of having the presidents in the US, is basically to start this policy level support conversation that would then enhance the cooperation we already have with the private sector.
Okay, all right. That's Sandra, if we can cross back to you. EU Development Commissioner has said that this $560 million program's major innovation is that it will allow the EU to link up cooperation with North Africa, South Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. What are the EU's plans to achieve this?
Well, the idea with this Pan-African Fund is increased mobility, so more knowledge sharing, enhanced relationships between African countries and industry experts, so that problem solving becomes a joint effort, so that everyone can progress. This is not just a fund, but a program that will involve as well the African Union, and I think in the long term promote better governance across the whole continent through boosting better practice across Africa.
Sandra, let's stay with you. The EU has launched its first phase of a new program that will advance Africa's integration process at a continental level. Now, it is the first ever EU program in development and cooperation that covers Africa as a whole. Now, what does the first phase entail, and which projects will benefit citizens directly?
It is indeed the first ever project of its kind, and it's certainly been celebrated that way here in Brussels. The first phase initially is indeed that 450 million euro, the equivalent in cash, as a primary injection. The subsequent phases will be further cash tranches, but this first launch and this first phase is going towards a variety of areas where the EU feels African countries can share knowledge, can share expertise, and tech savviness in some cases. So areas like sustainable agriculture, environment, climate change projects, education even. With these funds, the hope is that those areas, those sectors will see increased development, accelerated development because of that cooperation, that international cooperation in Africa, and therefore be felt by citizens directly much sooner than if countries took on these projects more individually.
All right, and Patrick, finally, if we can go to you. In the past, some investors have contented themselves with merely paying for labor and leaving no lasting legacy on the continent. Now, some have accused of even taking advantage of poor systems here in Africa to evade taxes. Are you confident that these measures are now in place to make sure that we will be able to avoid this in the future?
I think hindsight has always been good as a teacher. We've seen a lot of these things happening in other areas where you had international partners coming in to develop and some unscrupulous private sector organizations coming in as well. We are aware of that, and I think the governments in Africa are aware of that. And the legislation that you see coming in now that is governing public-private partnerships and also governing international investments are very, very clear on the expectations on taxation, expectations on technology transfer, local content, as well as simply being good citizens in the countries where they're coming in.
Well, we hope it all comes, and we here on the continent can start to see some of the advantages of this investment. Thank you for joining us. Patrick Obeth, he's the director of Kenya Private Sector Alliance. Thank you for joining us today. And Sandra Gaffman joining us from Brussels. Thank you both for your analysis. Now, in response to developments, this is what you had to say when we asked you, do you think that Africa's leaders made a strong case for their trade industries? Now, Salisu said depending on foreign funds with conditionalities cannot help the African country in moving further. Rather, it can compound the existence of malfunctioning. Ronnie from Uganda said the industry is growing, but why should we wait for Western help in every situation? We should wake up unless we are beggars. Perry says all our problems today have been caused by the U.S. and Europe. We don't need America to tell us that we're sick with malaria. We know what our problems are, and the solutions are in our hands. Africa, wake up. Indesh says, between the U.S. and Europe investments, I would rather Africa to work with the U.S. Let Africa not forget what Europe's done to Africa, robbed it and helped some of our corrupt leaders hide their wealth in Swiss and other European banks. Mustafa said depending on foreign support would not be an option or a solution to current African problems. It rather would add to the problems we have because of our corruption in the region. And McCorjo says that they may have a strong case. Those funds traded well and will contribute to our overall growth. Lee says it's a wait-and-see situation. We have gone through this West promises one too many times, very painfully, I might add. And Muwezi says it's a very good beginning. And lastly, Salim says China is the only one that helps. The rest, they're all talk. All right, let's take a look at commodities and how they're trading for the day. Specifically, we look at oil prices on both sides of the Atlantic, which rose more than $1. Now, with Brent nearing $107 a barrel after the United States approved airstrikes against militants in Iraq, raising the threat of oil disruption from the key oil producers. Coming up, we focus on a medical practice that's putting a smile on the faces of childless families in South Africa. Welcome back. You're watching Global Business. Now, low-income, childless South Africans are being helped in their efforts to conceive by IVF treatments offered by a Cape Town fertility clinic. Patients at the Tygerberg Hospital paying around 80% less for their modified treatments than private clinic patients undergoing traditional IVF process. For our grassroots segment tonight, we explore IVF.
A pioneering South African fertility clinic is helping bring in vitro fertilization IVF to the masses by cutting its cost by around 80%. In a country where infertility can result in huge social stigma, Dr. Thabo Matseseng and his team of doctors at Tygerberg Hospital have devised a cut-price way of delivering the treatment.
The whole concept or notion of IVF on a shoestring simply means what is that available, bare minimum service you can use or make them available for patients to have treatment available to them. In our setup, we work with the human resource, or the staffing is barely enough to make the whole treatment works effectively.
In a traditional IVF treatment, a patient receives a large amount of hormone therapy to produce as many eggs as possible. At Tygerberg, far less medication is used, producing fewer eggs, but enough to result in a viable pregnancy in up to 30% of cases. Local anesthesia and conscious sedation is used, an expensive process that requires theatre time and the hiring of an anesthesist.
In a complex conventional IVF, you'll use say in excess of 15 to 20 ampules of these injectables, together with other drugs to try to time when the eggs are going to come out or delay the spontaneous release of certain hormones that might spoil your eggs. In our cycle, we don't do that because the patient cannot afford that type of medication or that type of protocols.
Treatment at Tygerberg costs around $650 for a cycle of IVF treatment, compared to the average $3,000 in the private sector.
The way we stimulate our eggs to get, or ovaries to get the eggs, is different from the way the conventional IVF is done. And it has been done like this before, but because of the poor results or lower results, it was abandoned and better ways have been employed. But we can't afford the better ways, so we're still going back to the conventional or the old ways of stimulating eggs, bare minimum.
After trying to get pregnant for 9 years, 39-year-old Alina Foflela had given up on the idea of motherhood. But after treatment at Tygerberg, she's now the mother of a healthy 18-month-old girl.
In our culture, when you are married, you're expected to have babies. But anyway, luckily for me, I was married in a family where people are highly educated, so they were not pressurizing me with having babies, like something like that. But I, for one, I wanted a baby for my own. And my husband, we used to talk about it, but at the end we give up. We said, okay, if maybe it's God's will, we don't have babies, then we must just give up and live our lives.
Tygerberg Hospital will next year take part in a trial of a cheap portable laboratory that fits inside a shoebox. The Walking Eggs pint-sized lab simulates a process that has been used to transport cow embryos. After successful trials in the Belgian city of Genk, resulting in 17 successful pregnancies, the Walking Egg will be rolled out for the public in South Africa later this year. Carol Oyola, CCTV.
A wonderful program that I'm sure many will appreciate. Now that's it for this edition of Global Business. Remember, you can send us your feedback to Global Business Africa at cctv.com. You can visit our Facebook page, CCTV Africa. You can also stay in touch with Global Business on Twitter using the handle at CCTV News Africa. I'm G2 Abraham. Thanks for watching.